So I've decided to do a video to clarify a few things regarding my idealist stance in reply to some of the pushback from John Mountain, aka multi_purpose_weirdo, which I very much appreciate, John, because he gets me to think more deeply about my position, and the last thing I want is to be dogmatic. If I contradict for instance, the common assumption in physicalism that objects in reality have causal power, and suggest an alternative source, then on the face of it, I am being as controversial as a solipsist who denies the theory of mind, which we all take for granted. Because, classical evidence ostensibly suggests local causality, but things aren't always what they seem, and they are seldom black and white. I'm not saying that what I say is absolutely true, but to me, it is more compelling. We could be brains in a vat, like in the Matrix, but one thing that we can be sure of is that we are conscious, even if reality is an illusion. I'll try not to trot out the same material from previous videos, but I certainly hope to make you see the implications of idealism, and to show you that nothing about what we observe in the world contradicts it, and hopefully you will also see why the materialist worldview isn't viable. So, I have referenced Federico Faggin, the inventor of the microprocessor, to John, as well as to my friends Claudio Soprano and Dr. Michael Lee at the Non-Physical channel, when talking to them about metaphysical idealism in contrast to the doctrine of materialism. Faggin's inductive process in his theory of consciousness has led him to conclude that consciousness cannot be linked to the functioning of the body, ergo, our individual awareness can survive bodily death. I'm specifically going to focus on the inventor's views here because I don't want to rehash the Hoffman-Kastrup material I've already covered in previous videos. Faggin introduces a different analogy that may help us to think about the possible dynamics within idealism, such as the idea that the body behaves like a drone controlled top-down by consciousness. Faggin's theory invokes quantum phenomena to support the notion that consciousness lies at the roots of reality, such as the no-cloning theorem and Holevo's theorem. The former shows that we cannot reproduce pure quantum states which are unique to each of us. The latter limits the amount of measurable information to the classical bit for each qubit that describes the state. Faggin infers that a pure state of a quantum system is aware, since qualia, or conscious experiences, have all the essential properties of pure states. In essence, it is private knowledge which can only be minimally deduced externally due to classical restrictions. From this, the inventor concludes that classical machines can never be conscious, as classical information is reproducible, or the programming can be cloned, and by contrast, quantum states are private, and mathematical representations of pure states can never describe them or fully convey experiences, as they are only knowable from within. Now, my friend Michael Lee was quick to point out that it seems like the non-physical is giving rise to the physical top-down, But that's only if physical things like quantum mechanics permit pure states for conscious experiences. But I would bring our attention to the question of what those states are ultimately made of. Faggin describes experiences or pure states or qualia as private knowledge only minimally knowable from the outside, and that the mathematical representations do not describe the experience. So if we think of pure states as qualia, the contents of consciousness if you prefer, akin to the colours, so to speak, of a mental simulation, then the field of awareness which brings them into existence or shines a light on them is consciousness. Consciousness, after all, is where all qualia can potentially form and, therefore, has to be the ultimate reality. So from this we can understand that the colour red, say, can make an appearance in consciousness, but the appearance of redness is not conscious. It is just a mirage that can describe the mental simulation we call the physical world, or, to be precise, red describes a part of it. Ultimately, it is consciousness with its infinite potential that takes shape to finitely define a grand illusion that also gives rise to conceptual reality and its multidimensionality. And its multidimensionality also begets semantics, symbolism, archetypes, and other abstractions which are inevitably implied, some of which apparently true for all time, regardless of the existence of minds or even simulated realities that we come to think of as material worlds. Mathematics is full of universal and eternal truths, but I won't go off on a tangent here. I have heard Federico Faggin stating that he subscribes to idealism and that consciousness has to be prior to everything. The core of a pure state is consciousness itself, which is not reducible to anything else. So if the roots of reality are the quanta that code for qualia, the seed is consciousness. Faggin's take also agrees with Frank Jackson's conclusion for the knowledge argument in philosophy. Mary, the scientist, has never seen colour, but she knows all there is to know about it. Her mathematics can represent but do not describe in any way the experience of colour. When Mary steps outside to see our colourful world for the first time, she learns something new. Therefore, materialism is false. The notion of a physical reality exists as an illusion in consciousness. Physical reality as a single and vast quantum wave, including all the wave functions since the Big Bang, is nothing but a collective mentation. Ultimately, there is no physical or material. These are just words or concepts that we use to define the world we experience. There is only the mental, in essence, the qualitative experiences in awareness. Consciousness is the only reality. Consciousness is also synonymous with pure experience. So when we say experience of what, we invoke the qualitative forms or qualia that the formless, which is consciousness, can adopt. I'm essentially saying here that a non-physicalist monism is true, as opposed to the dualism of mind and matter which causes many problems. Consciousness is the ultimate reality and, of course, it is immaterial. So, instead of the physical being caused by the non-physical, I am saying that the non-physical that we take to be physical is caused by a purely non-physical primal state, or analogous to Einstein's abbreviation of E equals mc squared, to saying that it is all E, or energy, as mass is condensed energy. We could also say that reality is just non-physical. Consciousness is the pure non-physical awareness which is formless with infinite potential to focus on forms which are finitely defined. Qualia, comprising the observed physical properties of the world, equate with condensed non-physical forms, as it were, originating in the formless, which is awareness. If one wants to explain the etiology of a reality made of forms, one must start with the formless in order to have an explanation. We can't start with absolute nothingness, as that makes no sense, but we know that consciousness is real and irreducible and cannot be defined by a form in its pure state, because it is the knowing of things and the knowing of itself, as it knows that it knows concepts. It is empty but not nothing, and perhaps it tries to know itself in all its glory by illusions that don't fully convey it, knowing by what it's not, such as concepts like physical realities and brains as potential or tentative origins. It isn't panpsychism that's being proposed here, which I contend lacks explanatory power and runs away from the hard problem of consciousness, like eliminativism. The latter saliently so, as it tries to make the absurd case that consciousness does not exist at all. It only seems so. Faggin clearly states that in this illusory world, not everything is conscious when he postulates that classical machines, in contrast to the no-cloning theorem applicable to pure quantum states, can never be conscious. If you still think I am just making a priori assumptions to arrive at idealism, then revise this video and delve into Faggin, and it might also help to rehash comprehensive precedents on my channel to really come to grips with what real experts are saying. I strongly recommend looking them up and delving into their scientific papers. The idealist worldview can be derived a posteriori. I challenge anyone to come up with a better explanation for the existence of consciousness other than a fundamental from the materialist worldview. If you can cogently explain to me exactly how unconscious brain states give rise to consciousness as a byproduct, then I am back to being a physicalist. Until then, until such time, given all evidence and logical intuitions, I will always find idealism more compelling. I still get the impression that John Mountain is making presumptions based on his materialistic paradigm, despite the usefulness of his pushback in getting me to revise and reassess my current position. As I said before, the mind can indeed be altered with the introduction of psychedelics. It's no surprise that they fit the rubric of mind-altering substances. Decades of neurology also show us that mental faculties can be expunged via brain damage or cerebral malfunction. Nobody is denying these observations from the idealist camp. But ultimately, we are talking about the contents of consciousness being altered or removed, not consciousness itself in its purity. Hoffman's GTA analogy, or the Oculus scenario I have mentioned before, can easily explain why a damaged brain, analogous to a headset, can impair one's interaction with the world at large, which is analogous to a game or virtual reality. If your controls and perception of the game are impaired in some way, then you will have trouble dealing with the interface efficiently. Perhaps John Mountain can now understand the implications of what I've proffered so far, instead of accusing me of the arrogance that I did not display. I have been humble enough to say that if it turns out that materialism is true, then I don't understand and can't even begin to imagine how reality, which is purely physical, could beget an epiphenomenal witness through illusionism or otherwise. When John says that consciousness appears to be generated by the brain, it tells me that he has doubts about emergentism, even if he dishonestly claims that he only used the words appears to be because he's devoid of arrogance and for no other reason other than a profound epistemic uncertainty, and that I am sure he's repressing, just as I did. It is fine to say I don't know how the world works. I don't, even if sometimes I think I do. But I cannot help but find some ideas or interpretations of data more compelling than others. From where I am standing, consciousness, not its contents, is absolutely uncaused. It precedes space-time, so the apparent unconscious state where someone can miss years of their lives in a coma is not evidence that consciousness was eradicated during that period. It is only evidence that, as reported, the comatose individual who wakes up cannot remember anything having happened or doesn't remember having perceived any passage of time. Nobody can truly report having experienced unconsciousness, as this makes no sense. What people do experience is an incessant stream of consciousness without gaps, even if what is perceived implies a discontinuity, or, a better word for it, disjointedness. A lot of materialists that I have come across in the cognitive science sphere, such as Daniel Dennett, carry major misconceptions about the nature of consciousness itself. They don't seem to be observant enough of the very phenomenon they are trying to study. I have also pointed out how not remembering something isn't evidence of having been unconscious at the time, just like being on autopilot isn't synonymous with unconsciousness, and neither is daydreaming or rumination. Just like not remembering dreams doesn't equate with not dreaming at all. Everybody dreams. Memory is also still poorly misunderstood in those circles and puzzling to everyone, really, and certainly not explained within the physicalist paradigm. Psychedelics, for example, can impair brain activity whilst enriching conscious experience, often giving people the sensation that their minds have somehow expanded or they feel at one with everything. Suggesting that the brain could impair the potential of what can be perceived and could even act as a dynamical system that narrows one's focus when fully or optimally functional, as they say. Your doctrine of materialism has many loopholes, John. Materialism is nothing but hypothetical and does not warrant belief. The time to believe it is when everything can be explained under its rubric and the apparent mind-body relationship impasse is cogently surmounted. John, I have said much about idealism while you have maintained that materialism must be true, making the crazy tall claim that brains generate consciousness without providing anything to substantiate it. The onus is now on you to show how matter pulls off such a trick because, so far, people far more intelligent than me and you have tried and they are at a loss. As I said to you before, the materialist impasse gets worse with the knowledge that local realism is false, which implies that there is an absence of causal power in the world at large, which proves itself to be one big illusion with the passage of time. As a terse recap of what I've said in antecedent videos, space-time as fundamental is problematic when we take into account the limits of the Planck scale, the spectral problem, singularities in black holes, and the violation of Bell's inequalities with multiple quantum-entangled correlations. Consciousness, however, is something that is undeniably real, which one cannot find externally other than subjectively. If Federico Faggin's theory implicates the survival of consciousness beyond bodily death, which is backed by two theorems, then so be it. This isn't a conspiracy to vindicate religious claims about an afterlife, as you accusatorily implied. It just means that is where the evidence is leading us. It just means that reality naturally permits conscious continuity beyond death. It just means that we survive death after all. As I said to you before, everything I'm saying here isn't from wishful thinking, although I understand why some people might think that. For the longest time I have been a materialist, but now, for the reasons given, I find idealism the most convincing. Reality operates in a different way to what you surmised against your intuitions. The time to accept a new paradigm for you may be nigh. I challenge you to definitively prove physicalism is true against the theoretical conclusions of people much smarter than you, and win a Nobel Prize. I should have started by mentioning the new theory of consciousness I've been talking about here. It is called the Doriano-Faggin theory, which is based on the quantum theory work of Professor Giacomo Doriano, a real trailblazer specializing in quantum information theory, mathematical structures, and researching foundational problems of contemporary physics. Is a pioneer of informational theoretical derivation of quantum theory. The man introduced the first exact algorithm for quantum homodyne tomography of states, and generalized the technique for a universal method of quantum measurement. He was the first to develop an experimental scheme known as ancilla assisted tomography, and also improved the precision of measurement using quantum entanglement as a tool, influencing quantum metrology. I'm talking about a genius here, a genius who solved many problems with his team in the field of quantum information. The concept of quantum comb they introduced also led to a wide range of practical applications. He is essentially responsible for a new paradigm emerging in fundamental physics. The New Scientist magazine has hailed his approach to quantum field theory, together with collaborators such as Giulio Cirabella and Paolo Peritoni, as extraordinary, impressive, and profound. Federico Faggin and Giacomo Doriano are undeniably great. On the formulation of quantum theory based on information principles, Faggin based his theory on the nature of consciousness. As I facetiously said to Michael Lee recently, consciousness is the only reality. You are conscious of everything around you, conscious of everything in you. Consciousness is the only certainty. Consciousness brings everything into existence. Consciousness shines a light on everything. It's the consciousness of this and that and the other. Of course, there is much to learn about the ontology and dynamics of the source code and the programming of realities and space-time simulations like our own. And I am not talking about Nick Bostrom's simulation theory here, where our reality is virtual and generated by another physical reality. No. I am talking about idealism here. The source is non-physical and codes for the information we see around us. Within this paradigm, there are many possibilities for individual conscious observers. Perhaps we are eternally exploring an infinitude of concepts ad infinitum, and the only coping mechanism for eternity is to forget and to wake up to knowledge in a perennial way, like the Ouroboros. Or, as Michael Lee suggested, rather than circular experience, he theorizes branches of experience that sprout new buds, so to speak. So many possibilities. Perhaps novelty never ceases in terms of conceptual realities to be experienced, and Heraclitus' law of impermanence applies forever. Perhaps all possible persistent dreams are already in place rather than potentials. Already fully fledged space-time constructs and other dimensions we can't even fathom as human beings. The other day I watched a conversation between Daniel Dennett and Kurt Mungle on theories of everything, and an hour and 45 minutes into it, Dennett says, and I quote him verbatim here, "The content of our consciousness is a very useful user illusion that we are the beneficiaries of. To me, the statement is both tautological and oxymoronic. It's tantamount to saying the user illusion is useful to the user of the user illusion. I'd like to pose a question to Daniel Dennett. Who is the we in We Are the Beneficiaries?" Dennett's view is full of loopholes, and he's definitely not the right person to talk about consciousness when he's making gaffes like the one I quoted. People like Professor Bernard Carr, for example, are more open to other possibilities that go beyond the narrow conception of physicalism that Dennett holds dear. Carr is open to investigating psi phenomena, for example, and doesn't arrogantly claim that one need not look at the data for experiments in order to know that such things like precognition and telepathy are not possible. Bernard Carr has criticized such people in science. If you are going to be a proper skeptic, you owe it to yourself to look at data first before concluding in a premature fashion that what is being tested does not comport with reality, or, to be precise, in the case of people like Dan Dennett, prematurely concluding that something doesn't fit one's physicalist understanding of reality. Carr talks about human beings having little minds as part of a big mind suffused with multiple dimensions where materialism fails. He has also delved into ostensibly precognitive dreams and out-of-body experiences, which he has experienced before as well as having delved into Buddhism and meditation. Carr has also mentioned the literature that influenced him to look deeper into how reality works. Among his influences is the mathematician and philosopher Bertrand Russell, who thought that something like panpsychism or idealism made more sense than the doctrine of materialism. If you think I'm citing someone who's fringe here, just know that he studied relativity and cosmology under Stephen Hawking in Cambridge, and he is also friends with Ajahn Brahm, an eminent Theravada Buddhist monk. Anyway, people like him remind us of how much we don't know and how it's very easy to jump the gun even when assuming that something like materialism has to be the default mode. We should remember that Newtonian physics is only practical up to a point. Then we must apply Einstein's relativity, only to realize it also falls short of a theory of everything. It is not right to adopt an eliminativist approach in regards to consciousness because it doesn't seem to fit the physicalist puzzle. This is exactly what Daniel Dennett does. It's not there, he says. It only seems like it is. It's a load of cobblers. And now I need to take a quick break here. And we're back. Now, I'm aware that the brain comprises billions of nerve cells, but how does quantitative reality beget qualitative experience? Let's put it this way. Why should there be felt sensations of qualia, or any conscious experience whatsoever, conveyed by the interactive dance of some non-conscious elements? The alleged etiology of consciousness under physicalism appears to be miraculous to me. A miracle is something that defies explanation. In fact, its meaning can extend to something that violates the laws of physics. But the mind-body problem is only salient if one assumes that materialism is true. If you are materialists, despite the lingering hard problem of consciousness, I understand your doubts, and, trust me, I also still have a tendency to think in materialist terms. To understand idealism, it helps to remember that the objective world is also ultimately mental in nature. It is also worth remembering that we don't yet know how memory is stored in the brain, if we assume materialism to be true. And also worth bearing in mind that from the perspective of a conscious observer, there is only a continuous stream of consciousness. In other words, we are never truly unconscious. We are never truly in unconsciousness because we are, ontologically speaking, consciousness itself. There is a state of pure consciousness I once stumbled upon in meditation. Initially, my goal had been to try to induce a wake-initiated lucid dream, but what I got turned out to be something more profound. I glimpsed pure awareness of awareness, or metacognition, if you prefer. A state far divorced from conceptual reality and devoid of any thoughts and memories. Even my identity was gone. It was so ineffable that the best I can do is to say that it was like a blissful stillness or a radiant emptiness. It wasn't until later that I found descriptions of such state in the Tibetan Book of the Dead, and later I came across the Rigpa state in the Dzogchen tradition, which resonated with my experience. The ground of being made sense. Anyway, the experience was also ephemeral to me because pretty soon an onslaught of thoughts invaded my mind and the bliss was gone. Memory of that profound insight, however, remained. I was still a materialist then until some things started happening in the scientific community. What Hoffman points to may not be entirely correct, but the analogies he brings up in support of his hypothesis for conscious realism could be closer to the dynamics in reality. Imagine the brain is like an oculus, and what you and everybody else perceives is something like a Grand Theft Auto virtual reality. We all see the gore in the game, we all see the rules that apply, but the space-time and history of the game are ultimately illusions. The underlying reality that we don't see is the code, the electronics, the programming, which looks nothing like what is simulated. This is what I talked about with Claudio Soprano not too long ago on his channel, The Non-Physical. The reality we see is like a game. What Hoffman and Kastrup proffer does not contradict any of the laws of physics we observe, nor does it contradict Darwinism. All of that still applies, but no living organism perceives reality as it really is. In evolution, it wouldn't pay off to perceive the underlying electronics, but it certainly pays off to understand the narrative and nature of the game, a game representing things which ultimately don't exist. If you damage the oculus, of course you will have perceptual problems in the game. You might not even be able to control the avatar properly. If you also don't save the game, its memory is lost. All of this is analogous to the brain and how it correlates with mental faculties. But ultimately, objects in the game have no causal power. They only seem like they do. The etiological source is non-local. It is reasonable to assume that if you die in the game, you've had it, and you might as well take the headset off. What happens from there is, admittedly, speculation. So far, science has been about the game, the virtual reality we see around us. We probe, using reductionism, as far as the quantum pixels, as it were, until space-time no longer makes sense beyond the Planck scale. We are forced to question what we mean by physical, and we see that reality appears to be made of minuscule phantasms that we call fields, forces, and energy. But we have no idea about the essence of what makes up the world around us. Physics only tells us how things that appear to matter behave. The brain is made of all that, one collapsed version of a multitude of superpositions. If we look for consciousness in the objective world around us, we will not find it. We wouldn't even know what to look for or what it would look like. The only way to know about consciousness is to experience it firsthand. In fact, you have to be consciousness. You cannot be anything other than that. Everything else that comprises objective and conceptual realities are the contents of consciousness, the potential forms and representations it can adopt. Ultimately, objective reality is subjective for each and every one of us. In idealism, it is an agreed upon mentation. As Kastrup pointed out, our problems start when we assume that reality out there is not mental in nature, that it has to be something else. If we assume that, we have a perceptual problem besides many others. It is dualism that needs to be thrown out. If we throw out dualism and we say that only physical matter exists, materialism, then we must ultimately conclude that the mind isn't real, that consciousness is some kind of illusion, that it's not really there. But this is glaringly counterintuitive as to be downright absurd. How can people seem like they are conscious if we assume eliminativism to be factual? When it comes to consciousness, the seeming is the reality. It makes no sense. If there is anything in the universe that cannot be an illusion, that is consciousness. We could be wrong about the seemingly real world we perceive around us. The world could be like the Matrix. We could be brains in a vat for all we know. But the one thing that no mad scientist or demon pulling the wool over our eyes can ever take away from us is that we are having an experience right now. Nobody can deny that we are conscious right now. Everything else can be an illusion. and a deceptive one, to the point where it can easily drive us away from the truth. Consciousness is real, and it may in fact be the only reality. That is not to say that everything that is perceived is conscious. I am not advocating for panpsychism at all. I'm actually saying that I find it more compelling that ultimately only conscious observers exist which make this virtual reality matter. And there may be other space-time constructs and many other forms of reality, but the ground of being is, in this worldview, source consciousness. Consciousness is the ultimate reality. It might be that when one dies, a return to that primordial state occurs. I don't know. I am essentially saying that a non-physicalist monism is more compelling to me, where consciousness itself is uncaused, indestructible, and transcending space and time, because it is fundamental. The problem arises in dualism. Either the world is entirely material, in which case consciousness is a mystery, or consciousness is what we know most intimately, because we are it, and it is matter out there that is mysterious. And now we take a break. We don't even have to assume that life has some kind of meaning, that teleology is true beyond our little minds, as it were. It isn't my intention to vindicate religious belief here. I would agree that it doesn't have to involve any god or deity at all. I think meaning is derived by human beings as they go about their lives, perceiving things and having goals. If you ask, what's the meaning of life? You must follow up with another question. To whom? It means different things to different people. I'm not necessarily advocating for existential nihilism here, and certainly not saying with certainty that there is no intrinsic meaning to the universe, but there are people who reckon it is all meaningless, and that in itself becomes their meaning, because then they can always ask themselves, well, if I get a strong sense of meaninglessness about reality, what does this meaninglessness mean to me? Is it good or bad? Can I find purpose in what I take to be an intrinsically meaningless and purposeless world? You see what I mean? Popular beliefs aren't necessarily true, and this applies to all subjects. I'm sure you've heard of the ad populum fallacy, for example, and this brings me to my next topic. People tend to label, stereotype and judge according to propaganda that has been force-fed to them. What Marx proposed was a solution to a perceived problem. The ideal was a classless society. There are compelling arguments affirming that the socio-economic ideology is incongruous with human nature due to greed and the fact that some are less capable than others. No equity in nature, it seems. Hence why people used to say, and probably still do, some people are more equal than others. In history, capitalism proved to be more productive, especially when there is equality of opportunity as much as it can possibly be provided. Here in Britain, we have a welfare state, including the NHS, which was devised by Marxists in the old Labour Party. Today, Labour isn't what it used to be because its woke ideology doesn't resonate with the majority. Apart from the leftist capital, most of the rest of the country, especially rural areas, is conservative. Anyway, I do wonder what the Soviet Union might have been like under Trotsky, who valued education more than Stalin, who wanted the people brainwashed and credulous. Would Trotsky have developed a better Marxist state had he been given the chance? Who knows? Was the process of socialism leading to communism properly tested? Contrary to Das Kapital, Russia and China had been serfdom states before their communism, not capitalist nations as Engels and Marx intended their theory to be tested on. Karl Marx would view the USA as the best template for socialism. Unfortunately, things took a dark turn. Many all over the world here were disgusted with Stalinism and Maoism. Even the Trotskyists, who fought against Spanish fascism and General Franco, wanted nothing to do with communist Russia. Oppenheimer made distinctions between those who genuinely believed in well-intentioned Marxism and fairness, and those who would nefariously use it for power and control. In Homage to Catalonia, George Orwell also makes that distinction. In America, in the advent of the Cold War and McCarthyism, paranoia about communism as a great evil spread. In part, they were right, especially regarding Russia, Cuba, and China. But because of this, they also suppressed and penalized their best advocates for socialism, like Eugene Debs, who ended up arrested for treason. Neo-Marxists today sound authoritarian and use deconstructivist tactics in their propaganda. They talk about social constructs and employ the language of Foucault and Derrida to obfuscate even reality itself. Postmodernism is used as a political weapon to brainwash people. The woke movement is born out of that. There is nothing wrong with being progressive and liberal as long as you don't demonize and ostracize others for differing in opinion. Otherwise, democracy dies and authoritarianism rules. All voices should be heard. The problem with the left today is that youngsters think everything that came before is all wrong. Of course, our forefathers got many things wrong, but there is also much truth in the saying that we stand on the shoulders of giants. History, in particular, shouldn't be erased, but remembered so that lessons may be learned and real progress can take place. Thomas Ferguson once said that we need both conservatism and liberalism. The latter should push for progress and the former should rein it in and remind the latter that some things are worth preserving. There has to be a balance, some order. Otherwise, we risk destroying civilization in the belief that we can just build something better by erasing everything and starting from scratch. Ferguson was also a de facto centrist. Anyway, not to digress too much, but yes, organized religion is often used as a means to profoundly control people. It is the ultimate propaganda. It is dangerous to be Jewish or Christian in some Islamic states. It is dangerous to be a Muslim in Burma. During the Balkans War, the Serbian army, who were predominantly Christian, wanted to wipe out the Muslims. Centuries ago, it was dangerous to disagree or express disbelief in the dogma of the time. Heretics were persecuted. In Saudi Arabia today, atheists are regarded as terrorists and thus criminal. In the Western world, if you disagree with the woke movement, you run the risk of being utterly demonized, fired, and cancelled. Democracy dies with ad hominems and dishonest argumentation. A similar thing is happening in the scientific community regarding the hard problem of consciousness. If materialists can accept that the universe emerged ex nihilo, according to cosmology, what's wrong with consciousness as fundamental? I cannot stress this enough. Pristine awareness is not nothing. It's a thing in the sense that it has a qualitative nature. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to talk about it or refer to it. The words used to describe such experience don't capture what it is like to be in that state. But they are not useless either. They are pointers or humble attempts to describe said state. In fact, after I experienced it, I knew I had stumbled upon something profound. I had actually been trying to induce a wake-initiated lucid dream using meditation. But what I got was a more valuable revelation, a real inner sanctum. It wasn't until I read the Book of the Dead that I made the association. I looked at its words and I thought, that's it. That's what I experienced. The experience is ostensibly ineffable, but at the same time, as human beings, we can't be faulted in attempting to describe something new by pointing at things that we are already familiar with. So we say, well, the best I can do is to say that it's like this or that. It's pristine, it's empty, but somehow radiant, etc. Of course, these words will never fully capture that state, other than to try to get people to imagine what pure awareness would look like. But its imagination, of course, won't be the same as being it or becoming it. The truth is, we are it already. I guess those who want to wake up to it just need to meditate. The experience has to be something, otherwise we wouldn't be here to talk about it. The best pronoun for what I'm talking about here is not really it. It is I, the true self. I tend to think of an analogy. In the physical world, amongst many perceived materials, we get wood and metal. They look different, feel different, and have different applications. But if we use the reductionist approach to examine them closely, we come to realize that they are both made of protons, neutrons, and electrons. At a certain level, they are made of the same packets of energy, albeit arranged in different ways to make different molecules. So, in the example just given, it is true that at different levels they are both 1 and 2, together in the ground wave that emerged from the Big Bang, and therefore a part of it, and separate as perceived and distinguished by human beings. The phenomenon of consciousness, that which we truly are, can be thought of as one thing in many, and individuated selves will display many different attributes across space and time, but we all find common ground in one consciousness because it is naked, devoid of concepts, primordially empty of content, and babies' minds are quite close to this. We are currently experiencing the multiplicity or separateness concept of a single consciousness in the context of a space-time reality construct, which is ultimately mental. I do like the concept of Brahman in Hinduism, the eternal truth of a blissful consciousness that does not change, and yet somehow it is the cause of all changes, a unity giving rise to infinite diversity. If idealism is true, everyone should be welcome to it from all backgrounds and walks of life. People should not be ridiculed for defying a physicalist majority. It reminds me of the physicalist Wigner, who proposed with von Neumann that consciousness collapses reality because it is the original observer, not the detectors, which are made of the same fuzzy quanta and thus unreliable. Wigner later moved away from that view because he was worried his peers and the scientific community at large would view him as some kind of solipsist. To me, that is not a good reason for abandoning a cause that you believe in to begin with. It's like saying, I better not talk about this anymore because to most people it sounds crazy. That's not to say that we shouldn't be skeptical of people who claim to channel non-physical beings or spirits, such as Jane Roberts, who allegedly channeled an entity called Seth. The following is an excerpt from what Seth apparently said. Now, in my level of existence, I am simply aware of the fact, strange as it may seem, that I am not my consciousness. My consciousness is an attribute to be used by me. Now, when I read this, I detected an oxymoron. Either Seth is talking about metacognition, conscious of being conscious, in which case even he can't get behind the primacy of consciousness, or what he means by consciousness is something different from my definition. I suspect the awareness he talks about is what I generally mean by pure consciousness, empty of its contents but aware of itself, and the consciousness he refers to in the second clause would be what I call mind, because the mental is minding the contents of consciousness. When I am awake, I am minding the world. The world is an elaborate hallucination that we all share. In other words, Occam's razor here, the world is a mental construct that we are conscious of. The soul would be the true identity, the real true self, not the identity you assume on earth, because on earth you go through a transition of how you identify. You are no longer that little 7-year-old boy that you remember yourself to be. I say this because I have stumbled upon a state before, beyond all conceptual reality, where only a clear awareness remained, and somehow it was blissful compared to our quotidian perception. If Seth meant that he doesn't identify with the act of being conscious of this world, then I can understand that, because the true self is intrinsically empty of forms and can adopt modes of perception that include forms. But even the being conscious of this world phrase, which is what Seth apparently means by not my consciousness, includes a being conscious, which implies that in the moment of perceiving the world, the true self, which is formless, is or becomes or identifies with the perception. I had to make the distinction between consciousness and the mind. The former I equate with awareness, and the latter includes its contents. This is how I see it, and nothing can get behind consciousness because it is the ground of being. Nothing can be said to exist without it. If there are no conscious observers, the things to be observed might as well not exist. So what is a soul made of? It is nothing but individuated consciousness. You can't say the soul is apart from consciousness, otherwise it is like saying that the soul is unconscious if stripped of awareness, in which case it ceases to exist. We have to be really careful with what we mean by words. If there is no observation, there is no confirmation of existence. So I would correct Seth on his usage of words, assuming that we agree on the metaphysics but disagree on the semantics. Otherwise, I can't get behind what Seth or Jane is saying, assuming Seth isn't just a subpersonality of a mentally ill Jane, a product of mental disorder. It is possible that Seth could be an otherworldly entity that used Jane's brain and was forced to use her flawed semantics, and in the end it fried her brain. Finally, I'm going to leave you with a quote here from Edgar Allan Poe. Actually, it's a couple of quotes. There is a class of fancies of exquisite delicacy which are not thoughts, and to which as yet I have found it absolutely impossible to adapt language. They arise in the soul only at its epochs of most intense tranquillity, when the bodily and mental health are in perfection, and at that mere point of time where the confines of the waking world blends with those of the world of dreams. I am aware of these fancies only when I am upon the very brink of sleep, with the consciousness that I am so. It is by no means an irrational fancy that, in a future existence, we shall look upon what we think of our present existence as a dream. Thank you very much for listening.